many programs that has nothing to do with Israel, and it focuses on the poverty and the freedom of speech and democracy and history in the Arab and around the world. In fact, it has several programs, and it has been accused recently by the Israeli and by the Egyptian government and the Tunisian government that it was inciting the revolution for democracy and freedom around the Arab world. So people are blaming Al Jazeera for the uprising in Egypt and in Tunisia, and maybe, I think it is doing this, and I think that they are leading public opinion in the Arab world in this uprising, and I think they should be commended on this issue. Other media in the Arab world, and we'll talk about it later as we move on to the discussion. Yes, there is an issue that we see things different than the rest of the world see it, or at least the Western world see it, as far as Israel and the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And yes, we have our own perspective on it, and we should not, hide it. And I think we should put it forward, and we should talk about it. We have a major disagreement how we view Israel and how the Israelis have been dealing with the Palestinians. This is something that we need to talk about.
Thank you, gentlemen. I guess I'm going to start with a few questions. We have plenty of time this afternoon, but we want to get to your questions as well. But let me start with a few. And I'd like to, since Egypt's in the news, start with that. I've been following coverage of the uprising, the protests, if you will, as they're covered by the U.S. media. Have not seen Al Jazeera's coverage or coverage outside of the United States, but I haven't noticed any sort of significant anti-Israel element, either to the protest or to the coverage. Dr. Kedar, am I missing something? And does that surprise you that in this instant Israel hasn't been sort of made a scapegoat?
Some interviewees in those demonstrations mentioned that they are actually demonstrating as Mubarak, who is supported by the United States of America and of course Israel. Means they wrap him in the same wrapping with Israel and the United States as those who should be ousted from the Egyptian street, as if Israel controls Egypt. So Israel is not the issue today, because now Al Jazeera succeeded to bring the spark from Tunisia to Egypt to blow up the Egyptian situation, because as you know, Egypt was a barrel of explosives for decades because of those unplanned neighborhoods which are in Egypt. 40 million people in Egypt live in unplanned neighborhoods without electricity, without sewage, without water, without anything. And by the way, I think that the American media, if I may mention them, never showed this situation in Egypt. This is why it's such a surprise these days, because everybody says, well, what happened in Egypt? Definitely, whoever knows the reality about the Middle East knows that the question of Egypt was not the question of whether it will happen, the question was when it will happen. So Al Jazeera brought the spark or the match from Tunisia to Egypt, and people in Egypt felt all of a sudden that yes, we can, because this what happened in Tunisia a week or 2 weeks before it happened in Egypt. So this is actually what sent those people to the street. By the way, by the encouragement of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are there to feed those unfortunate 40 million people in Egypt. And definitely, I think that they are those because of whom those people are still alive. Because in those conditions, as they live in those unplanned neighborhoods with such density, without any infrastructure, without on an income of maybe 25 cents per day per capita, definitely those Muslim Brotherhood were those who catered for those unfortunate people. And Al Jazeera, of course, represent the Muslim Brotherhood. As you know, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi has the highest pulpit in the world named Al Jazeera, and he is the mouthpiece of the Muslim Brotherhood. Definitely a channel which represents a Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, not in vain, Osama bin Laden chose Al Jazeera to be the pulpit from where his tapes will be aired, not because Al Jazeera is there, because Al Jazeera, because the nature of Al Jazeera and the agenda of Al Jazeera. This is media with agenda. So all in all, this is some kind of jihadi, terrorist channel. This is why they are against Israel all the time, against the Arab regimes, against those fat cats which ate every possible thing in Egypt for decades, since the revolution of 1952. And of course, they are the constant target of Al Jazeera. Not in vain.
Let's let Mr. Siblani have a chance at this question. If this turns out to be a successful democracy movement in Egypt...
It's not democracy.
And if...
It's not the right term.
But,
Because democracy is human rights, political freedoms, rights of minorities, women's rights, gays and lesbians. Those Muslim Brotherhood do not advocate any of these rights.
well, let me pose the question as an if. If this turns out to be a successful democracy movement in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in other places, and Dr. Kedar is right that it's being fanned in part by Al Jazeera, that would be a very powerful role for the media folks to play, and if it works out, not a negative role, a very positive role, wouldn't it?
Well, first of all, it's true. Al Jazeera is playing a major role in the revolutions. I mean, this is a fact. But let's go back a little bit in history and look at us here in the United States and the Vietnam War. Yeah. If it wasn't for the media, what would have happened in the Vietnam War?
We would have won.
How? Well, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure. But if it wasn't for the media to tell us how wrong our government was doing, we would have been probably in the war in Vietnam. Or maybe we would have won, or would have lost. Things would not have been the same. My point is, yes, media plays a major role. And Al Jazeera is playing a major role because it's a major channel. Now, what happened in Egypt, what's happening today in Egypt has nothing to do with outside Egypt at this time. Of course, it's going to affect outside Egypt. Foreign policy is going to be on the shopping block, absolutely. And we'll talk about this later. But when you have 40% of the Egyptians below poverty line, when you have the leader of Egypt that has been reported by not Al Jazeera, by the British media and the American media has been accumulating a wealth. He was a general in the Air Force when he took office 30 years ago. Today he owns more than $40 to $70 billion in assets. And 40% of his people are below poverty line, living in poverty is more than $1 or less than $1 a day. That is the reason why people are angry in Egypt. It's not because Al Jazeera is telling them to go and demonstrate. There are fundamental reasons why Egyptians are angry.
Mr. Siblani, if Al Jazeera turns its
Let me
attention
just
to those...
make one more point,
Okay.
if you don't mind. Also corruption in Egypt. I mean, we have seen in the last maybe 10 days samples of corruption in the Egyptian regime that is beyond even imagination. And this corruption is not only in Egypt, in all the Arab regimes. And also oppression. We've seen how people were oppressed in Egypt. We had examples we've seen on television through Al Jazeera. Yes, but Al Jazeera didn't make it. They filmed it. Actually, they broadcasted it. Somebody else filmed it because they were cut off from broadcasting. So what happened in here is, this is a revolution by the people. Al Jazeera did not pump it. Al Jazeera did not ignite it. It was ignited by the reasons that I said before, and also more reasons.
But Mr. Siblani,
It really, it really surprised the hell out of all of us what happened in Tunisia and Egypt. I mean, I was surprised and shocked. And I'm sure that many people were surprised and shocked as well. So for anyone to claim that Al Jazeera is doing all of this, is giving Al Jazeera more credit than it really deserves.
Mr. Siblani, I mean, you talk about the conditions, and this being about the conditions. I think Dr. Kedar agrees that this uprising springs from the miserable conditions that Egyptian